then you'd expect that everybody has the same risk of predation at any age, and they can be taken or not taken. So this is called a type 1 curve. A type 2 curve looks more like this. So what type 2 curve says is that initially there's low probabilities, but as you get older and older, so senescence kind of sets in. So senescence are diseases due to aging. And then there's the other one, which is called a type 3 curve. Now remember, these types have to be defined on a log scale. And so this tells you about the relative rates of change in mortality. The proportion that die at each age is initially high and then lower. So this is, you'd expect, like, for example, in fish. Small fish have many, many kinds of predators that will eat them. Bigger fish are only susceptible to fish that are bigger than them. And the number of fish that are bigger than you gets less and less as you get bigger. So these, you might say, they're populations which have predators on them that don't discriminate against age and take any age equally likely. These are individuals where the young are much more vulnerable than the older. And these are individuals where somehow the young are less vulnerable and the older become more vulnerable because of the process of aging. So what kind of populations would fit into type 3s? No, not bacteria, because... Yeah, sorry, type 2, yeah, type 2. Yeah, right, so situations where there's maternal care or social care of young and protection of young, and where death comes mainly from aging processes. But in fact, it's very difficult to have a curve like this. So humans, for example, may start out with a high rate due to childhood mortality due to disease. And once individuals reach a critical age, it levels off, and then falls off as individuals senesce, so people die. So you might say this happens around age 4 or 5, and this happens around age 60, when individuals start having heart problems, organ failure, and so it goes on. But now something interesting happens that they're finding out that we didn't know, let's say, 30 years ago, but we know now, is that this curve actually goes like this. It has a little bit of a tail there. How would you interpret that tail? And in fact, people have found this research, not only in humans, but this tail exists in populations like fruit flies. So how would that tail come about? Yeah? Yeah. 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 Right, so it turns out that genetics starts to play a big role, and there's some people who seem to have genes for longevity. It's not entirely, it's probably a very complex phenomenon, but there's some people that seem to age much better than others. And we haven't deciphered all the genetics of this, but you can see it in old individuals, that sometimes there may be a person who's 90, looks great. And what this says is that if you take the group of 80-year-olds, the proportion that will die in the next 5 years is a higher proportion than if you take the proportion of 90-year-olds and take who will die. And that's because most of the people who are vulnerable to senescing senesce out during this 80 to 90-year-old period. And then you have people that just seem to be able to live on. And in fact, a lot of these people, what happens is your body doesn't heal very well. I've seen this phenomenon happen a lot. When somebody's very old, falls and breaks a limb, it's kind of the beginning of the end. It doesn't heal very well. It brings on other complications. So one of the main reasons that people die when they're old is they have some kind of fall, and then their body doesn't heal very well, and that sort of brings on the process of death. All very depressing. But so let's get on to happier things like births. Okay, so in a life table, we've talked about the mortality column. Then there's something called the natality column. Let's see, I equals 0, 1, 2, 3. So usually you set out a life table in this way. It's discretized. What we were talking about here is plotting it as a continuous function of time. So you can either plot L of t or the log of L of t, depending on what you want, whether you want to transform it or not. This is a continuous time. In life tables, we typically discretize it, and we choose an interval of time that is appropriate for the population. So typically you want to have maybe at least 10 categories, 20 categories. With humans, we have many more categories. We might have 100 categories because we've got very good data. But for lots of populations, you don't have very good data. If you're rearing fruit flies in the laboratory, where you've got tens of thousands of individuals, then you can have a lot of categories, but this would be daily numbers. For a lot of biological populations that people study, like small rodents, a weekly number maybe, or a monthly interval of time may be good. So here's a life table for a small rodent, a vole, called Microtus agrestis. And here the T is measured in weeks. So let's just get... So T is measured in weeks. So you've got 8, 16, 24. You could call this 1, 2, 3, 4 and say 1 represents 8 weeks. Then T would be measured in 8 weekly intervals. So this is equivalent to saying 1, 2, 3, 4 or 8, 16, 24. It doesn't matter. But we discretize according to 8-week blocks. And the source for this is from an oncology book that goes back to 1954. And so, for example, if L of T is the number of, for every individual born, 83% will be alive at week 8, 73% at week 16, and at week 72, 3% of individuals will be alive. Now, of course, these numbers are treated as though that's what it is, deterministic, the truth. But of course, these are estimates. So if somebody else took another population, they might get different data. So when biologists work with things like this, they have uncertainty and confidence intervals. We're going to ignore this. What this says, BI is a measure of the proportion of young, or the number of young that a female in that age group will produce. But actually not the number of young, the number of females per female. So depending on the population, there's some populations where sex is not a factor. Like we talked about clonally reproducing lizards. Each lizard is in fact a female. She lays eggs, but she doesn't have to mate. And each individual is a female, so the only kinds of individuals are females. In life tables, sometimes what we do is we only look at the female sex, because the female is the one that's reproducing, and you can only do this if you say that every female is not limited in terms of their reproductive capacity by the number of males. So if there are lots of males around, then the rate at which the population grows is determined by the female's ability to reproduce. Obviously, if it's a sexually reproducing population, there are very few males. A lot of females will not reproduce because they haven't got males to find as mates. So what does this 0.8 mean? It means for every female in the category of age 0 to 8 weeks, for every female that's there, you can expect 8% of them to have one female progeny. So if you've got 100 females in that category, over that 8-week period, you would expect that those 100 females produce 8 new females. Now, I guess you need sexual maturity, so you'd say it's probably happening in week 7 or in the last week. It's not happening in the first week. Very often in these life tables, you'll see zeros until you get a point where individuals are sexually mature. In this life table, it turns out that individuals can mature before 8 weeks, but only a very small proportion, and that figure reflects the fact that they're probably reproducing in the last period of this 8 weeks. Then after that, you have 0.3, which means that for every female in that category, 8 weeks later, there'll be 30 young females. And if the sex ratio is equal, then you expect those females will produce 60 young, of which 30 will be females. Now, not all populations have equal sex ratios. And in fact, in humans, the sex ratio is biased at birth. Do you know if it's biased towards males or females? What do you think? Any? Yeah? So there are more females than there are males. No, it's the other way around, typically. There are more males. Because males are the weaker sex. It turns out that the probability that a male will survive the first few years of life is lower than a female. And that's because we're genetically inferior. Why are we genetically inferior? Yeah, the sex chromosome, we have this Y chromosome. And so we're basically haploid for a number of critical alleles on the sex chromosome. And that's why we're more susceptible to certain genetic diseases, like hemophilia. So recessive genetic diseases that are linked to the sex chromosomes, like hemophilia, in males they're exposed. There's no second allele to neutralize it. So because of that, nature has compensated by making a few more males than females. It actually turns out that, and this is rather an amazing phenomenon, and we've seen it in humans, but it's certainly been studied and documented in animals in even a stronger way, and that is that the sex ratio varies depending on whether times are really good or times are stressed. And in times of stress, you get more males in many situations, in many populations. Times are good, you get more females. So, for example, after the Second World War, it was documented that the sex ratio actually changed and went up a little in favor of more males at birth. It's almost as though God knew that he or she had to replace all the males that were killed in the trenches. And that's one interpretation. I'm not going to say it's true. You can put on whatever interpretation you like. But as far as I'm concerned, nature is this blind evolutionary process. But some amazing things happen in terms of the evolutionary process, so that they're complex controls that even affect the sex ratio. You might say, how does that happen? It happens through the physiology of the female. So females, most or a large number of eggs that are fertilized never get embedded within the first month in the womb. So in order for a successful birth to take place, the egg has to be fertilized and has to embed in the womb, and this is affected by the physiology of the mother. And if the mother's physiology is stressed, then there may be differential rates. There are also differential rates on the competitive of sperm under different conditions. So there's subtle things going on that make it rather interesting to see these biological phenomena. And of course, we study it, or biologists study it quite a bit in animals. So now, what do we do with life tables? So there are these derived values, and we've talked about SI, which are the proportion of individuals that survive from age I to I plus 1. And this is a useful statistic, particularly if we're constructing a life table backwards, that is, by getting latitudinal data. But there's this thing called R0. Now, R0 is a very important concept. So with Ebola going on, has anybody heard the term the R0 for Ebola? So when it comes to diseases, there's this notion of R0. In diseases, what is this concept of R0? If we have one case of a particular disease, like the guy who came in and had Ebola and came into the United States. So we have what we call the index case, and then we ask, did that person to give it to anybody else? Now, if you do statistics on this and you say, what is the expected proportion of individuals that a single case will pass on to? This is the reproductive value. It's the number of new individuals in the next generation that comes from an individual in this generation. It's the number of females that a female can expect to produce in the next generation. So if you take every female alive today in this generation, just starting out, so you take all the 20-year-olds, and then you say, okay, in the next 20 to 30 years, these 20-year-olds are going to produce another crop of 20-year-olds. How many are they going to produce? Are they going to produce more than there are currently or less? So if you've got 120-year-olds in the next generation, do you have 105 or do you have 95? If you have 105, R0 is 1.05. If you have 95, R0 is 0.95. So R0 is the growth rate of the population. So you ask, is the population growing? Now, in a disease, this is very important, because the question is the epidemic going to grow? Are there going to be more cases when this individual either dies or gets cured? Are they going to create at least one other case? Are they going to create 2, 3, 4? If you have an R0 of 2, that means that in each generation the population is doubling. Now, this R0 are females per female if your life table data, if your BI is females per female. So in order to calculate R0, you might say, we've got all these BIs. You could have a look at the sum I equals 1 to n BI. Why does that not tell you how many individuals each female is going to reproduce in the next generation? Why does the Li come into it? So if BI is the proportion of females that produce a female in the next generation, and you keep adding this up, then this will tell you the proportion of females that any female will produce if she lives all the way to the end of the life table. However, not all females are going to make it to the end. So you have to weight this by the probability that a female survives to a particular age. So that's why you don't just sum up the BIs to get R0, but you have to weight it by the probability that an individual gets to age I. And then that will give you the net reproductive rate. Now, if you've got the net reproductive rate, I say to you the population is doubling if R0 is 2. Or the population is increasing by 5% in each generation if R0 is 1.05. Or the population is decreasing by 5% in each generation if R0 is 0.95. But that still doesn't tell you how rapidly or the population may be growing or declining, because it only says in each generation, but you don't know how long a generation is. Does everybody understand that? So in order to understand the rate of change, you have to say how long is a generation. And it turns out that if you sum BILI times I and divide by R0, that this gives you the length of a generation. So you get this number G. This number G is obtained by taking the BILI and saying the sum of I times BILI over the sum of BILI. And you calculate that, and you get this number G. And so G is this generation time. Let's see if we calculated a generation. So they're going to be, I don't know if I haven't got any examples here of such calculations, but I think there's one in your homework. This is like saying that the number of individuals at generation T, so if T is 1 year and G is 23 years, then at year 23, the first generation, then year 46 is the next generation. It's like the population is increasing by that amount from year 23 to year 46. You're taking, and so here's year 46, T plus 1 times G. So if G is 23 years, then T plus 1 is 2 times G, which is 46. So N at year 46 is equal to N at year 23 times the R0. And if R0 is doubling, then it means you have twice as many individuals in year 46 as you had in year 23. So this comes back to our very simple equation of how numbers grow. So we've taken an age-structured population, and we've got out an essential value here that tells us how rapidly this population may grow. So for example, if you look at the life table for humans in different countries, you can calculate where you expect that population to be in 40 years or 50 years or 60 years using these kinds of equations. Because you can calculate its R0 and you can calculate its generation time. It turns out that many populations, like Japan and some European populations, are actually declining over time. And some, like the United States, are growing. So for example, if the population doubles every 23 years, then you can say that's basically equal to some annual growth rate, 3 to 4% annual growth rate or whatever. You can calculate the exact value. Then you can make statements like the US population is growing by 3% a year. So from life tables, you can calculate 3.1, 1.3, whatever the number is, or is declining by a certain percentage each year. However, this kind of calculation doesn't take into account where the population might be at a particular time. So for example, if I take a population with particular life parameters, this calculation assumes that the age structure in the population is distributed according to a stable distribution that you'd expect from having a life table like this. So if you have a life table like this, you expect that the number of 1-year-olds compared to the number of 2-year-olds compared to the number of 3 would reflect these survival rates. But when you come to populations, they aren't necessarily in the stable age distribution. Stuff has happened. The most obvious one is there's been a big famine, a huge epidemic, or a war. In an epidemic, if it wipes out all the old people who are not reproducing, and only keeps in the young people that are reproducing, then there'll be like a spurt, because the population, this formula doesn't apply because you have a lot of individuals that should be there that aren't there in this calculation. So for example, if you take a population that is exactly the same life table, let's say a human population, and all the females are 10 years old versus 20 years old. In 10 years, you're not going to get any kids for a few years. When 20 years old, you're going to get kids immediately. So it depends on the age structure. So certain things happen that reflect the history, and this history might be dramatic, or it might reflect, say, for example, in China, you have this one-child policy, and this has gone on for a long time. If you have a one-child policy, it means you're not getting the natural number of young kids that you'd expect under normal growth circumstances. So then you have this bulge of old individuals. So, for example, you get these pyramids that are drawn like this. And this may be the number of 0 to 1s, 1s to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on. And you expect this pyramid to have a structure like this that reflects declines in the population. It should actually reflect this curve. However, if all of a sudden you artificially reduce these numbers over here, then you might get a curve that looks like this. So it has this bulge. And this is a bulge of older people, because you're not replacing all these individuals that you should have had in here are artificially restricted. And this bulge can move up so that ultimately, sometime later, you get something that looks like this, depending on the policy. And you might get something that looks like this, which means you've got all these old people, and you haven't got enough young people below to support them. And so this may be all the individuals who are working. This may be all the individuals who are too young to work. I should take this up a bit. And this may